DNA, the foundation for all life on Earth. Its unique structure and process of replication are crucial components in creating the variation that is key to the theory of evolution. The theory was originally proposed by Charles Darwin in 1859. What evidence do we have for the theory today?
I mean, there's this phrase that nothing in biology makes any sense except through the light of evolution. And in some ways, I think there's a lot of truth in that.
Evidence for evolution, I guess, has grown and accumulated over 200 years or so. Evolution is a theory, a fairly widely accepted theory, but a theory nonetheless, which is being added to over time as we test ideas and balance that against the evidence that we have in nature.
We clearly see things like fossils in the geological record, and those fossils often look similar but not identical to species that exist now. So we can see fossil birds or fossil mammals and so on. And what we can see in the long term then is that there has been the easiest way to explain all that data is that there's been evolutionary change with time, so that species that existed in the past resemble species that exist now but are not necessarily identical to them.
When replicating, a strand of DNA will first unwind before splitting its base pairs down the middle. A polymerase will then replicate the DNA on each strand, creating 2 new strands of DNA. Occasionally, however, a mistake will be made and a mutation will be introduced.
It's very much the same as if you were to take a book and start copying out the book. Inevitably, you will make some changes without realizing it. You probably won't make a 100% perfect copy of that. You might produce a slightly better gene or a slightly worse gene. You might produce a very bad gene, or you might have no effect at all. But that copying process, because it's imperfect, results in some changes occurring along the way.
Evolution says that natural selection will choose the strong amongst the population, and at the expense of the weak. The weak will die out, and so will their genes. The strong, however, through natural selection, will survive long enough to breed and pass on their genes, and so their genetic traits will be passed on to the next generation.
So we know how all these animals came to be here, but where to next?
Some of the more convincing evidence for climate change comes from ice cores, and it's from these ice cores that we get a really longitudinal overview of what's happened to climate. And when we compare the data for over hundreds of thousands of years, and we compare things like carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which we can measure from those ice cores, there's a very strong correlation in the way that carbon dioxide levels and the Earth's actual temperature coincided. It almost parallels it. What we've found in the last 150 years is that we are in an interglacial and that we are in a warm period in our climate. And CO2 levels, of course, paralleling that. But this is the first time that CO2 levels have exceeded 300 parts per million. There's a strong correlation between that increase, the increase in CO2 levels exceeding 300 parts per million, and the idea that all this change is anthropogenic, that it is generated by people burning fossil fuels.
I think we can say some general things about whether species will or won't survive. Some species require interactions with, very specific interactions with other species, and that if that's disturbed because 1 or 2 other species are affected, then that may have a follow-on effect for a whole range of species. So you could have an entire ecosystem disappear because a handful of species were affected by the climate change.
I guess from our point of view, the interesting question is what impact will it have on life on Earth? And there have been many so-called mass extinction events throughout the history of life. There's been at least 5 of them that we know about. We are living through, if you like, the 6th major extinction event at the moment. The rate of extinction at present is about 100 to 1,000 times higher than it normally is, than it would have been, say, I don't know, 1 million years ago, for example. There's no doubt that life will continue, but what life and whether it'll be, as recognisable to us as the life we see today, who knows? I mean, it depends how severe the climate change is.